Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and Advisory Committee, I welcome you here this evening to our Foreign Policy Series discussion on the recently signed interim agreement between Iran and the P5 plus Germany in Geneva. We have gathered a distinguished panel of Iran experts who will walk us through what just happened and what may lie ahead. Headlines during the last 48 hours have run the entire spectrum from victory for Iran and historic mistake to first step toward peace and Obama achieves historic measure. Most comments have followed what has become a predictable Republican-Democrat divide, but recent polls indicate that nearly two-thirds of all Americans support an agreement with Iran that would lift sanctions in return for Tehran restricting its nuclear program, though only about a third of Americans are confident that such a deal will prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. What is undeniable is that there are many layers to this cake, and we look forward to hearing from our panelists as they discuss whether the agreement brings new hope for nuclear negotiations with Iran or further disappointment. Our panelists are no strangers to the World Affairs Council audiences. We welcome back all three. Ambassador John Limbert is Professor of International Affairs at the United States Naval Academy. A career Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Limbert is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. He served in Tehran at the U.S. Embassy, where he was held captive during the Iran hostage crisis. His last postings at State were as Dean of the Foreign Service Institute's School of Language Studies and as Chief of Mission in Khartoum, Sudan. Dr. Trita Parsi is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council and an expert on U.S.-Iran relations. He is the author of two books, Treacherous Alliance, which won the 2008 Arthur Ross Silver Medallion from the Council on Foreign Relations, and A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, which was selected by Foreign Affairs as the best book of 2012 on the Middle East. Barbara Slavin, our moderator, is a Washington correspondent for Al Monitor and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she focuses on Iran. She is a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy and Iran. She is the author of the 2007 book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on a cold and nasty night, but I think the news of this past weekend is sufficient to perk everyone's interest. I have to kid Trita. I guess you're going to have to do another book called Another Roll of the Dice, or several
the winning
rolls,
roll of the dice.
Several rolls of the dice. And it's a pleasure to be here with both John and Trita, who are members of the Iran Task Force of the Atlantic Council. We put out a report last March that made a number of recommendations, and I'm very pleased to say that it appears that people were listening. And if you go back and look at that report, you'll see that the agreement that was reached and some of the other measures that are part of this agreement were all recommendations of the Atlantic Council Task Force. So enough of a commercial for our efforts. I promised I would play devil's advocate a little bit because, as you will see, I think Trita and John and I generally agree that this is a positive development. Let me briefly sketch some of the main elements of the deal. Iran stops producing uranium that's enriched to 20% U-235. This is very close to weapons grade. Iran will stop it, and it will take the stockpile it has and turn it into a form that cannot easily be made into weapons. So this puts time on the clock in terms of whether Iran could break out and make a nuclear weapon. Iran also will stop most of its work at a place called Arak, A-R-A-K, which is a heavy water reactor. If completed, it could yield plutonium in its spent fuel, and Iran has basically agreed to pause on this as well for 6 months. The Iranians are not going to add any new centrifuges to the 10,000 that are spinning away. They're going to give the International Atomic Energy Agency daily access to their enrichment facilities. Right now, the IAEA gets to go about once a week. And I understand there's also going to be remote monitoring, remote cameras installed, at least according to one account. So more transparency and limits on the program, and turning the stockpiles into less dangerous forms. The Iranians will continue to enrich uranium to 5% or below U-235. They say they won't increase their stockpile. They'll take the excess and turn it into, again, a powder form, a form that can't be readily turned into weapons. But they will still have a stockpile, which, if further converted, could give them a half-dozen nuclear bombs. To play devil's advocate, this agreement does not oblige the Iranians to dismantle a single centrifuge or take apart any of their nuclear infrastructure. What it does is it pauses the program, and it prevents Iran from continuing to advance toward the point where it could make nuclear weapons. During this 6-month period, the United States and the rest of the Perm 5 and Germany are supposed to negotiate an agreement with Iran that will be more long-lasting, although how long-lasting is something that is not clear. So my general take from this is that this is an excellent first step. I think the reason why I'm pleased about it is because it resulted from the most intensive one-on-one negotiations between the United States and Iran that we have seen since the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when we did have such talks. And those of you who've read my book know that we did actually have direct talks with the Iranians after 9/11 for about a year and a half. However, there were more talks this time. They were at a higher level between our Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, and others from the Iranian government. And the result is certainly historic. We have not seen an agreement like this ever between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. If it works, it means that we may see progress on other issues in the Middle East where Iran has taken a different side from the United States, and we may begin to see some real progress on bilateral relations between the U.S. and Iran. If it fails, though, it's going to be an enormous disappointment, and we're going to hear not only the U.S. Congress calling for more sanctions, but we will hear the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu, talking again about military action against Iran. So I think that's, hopefully all of you could hear me, yes? That's where we are now. And I want to turn to our very excellent speakers. First to Trita Parsi, because Trita was in Geneva for this round, actually for 2 rounds, I think, yeah? And so he really knows what the drama was like.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a great, great pleasure being here at the World Affairs Council. It's always a great pleasure to be here with my 2 good friends, Barbara and John, who I owe both quite a lot to when it comes to understanding this issue. You didn't play that much of a devil's advocate, I think. You were quite positive about this deal, and rightly so in my view. It was a very interesting atmosphere in Geneva, and I think the last day was actually quite tough. There were for long moments where a large number of journalists were essentially sitting in the lobby of the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva, whereas the negotiators were on some of the upper floors. And they were starting to get a sense that, you know what, this may actually not work out. In the beginning, I think the vast majority were quite optimistic for a very simple reason. The cost of failure is so great for both sides. There's a symmetric situation in the sense that neither side can feel particularly comfortable walking away thinking, you know what, even if there's no deal, we're in a pretty good situation. The Iranians are not going to be in a good situation, mindful of how the sanctions are affecting their economy so negatively, but perhaps more importantly, from the perspective of the immediate decision makers, because of the difficulty for the Rouhani government to retain the current position that they have if they cannot deliver on negotiations. They have presented themselves, and I think rightly so, to be dramatically different from the Ahmadinejad crowd, and to be able to handle diplomacy in a sophisticated way, but they need to be 2 to tango, and if they couldn't tango, they wouldn't be able to get some of the sanctions relief that they're looking for, which means that the economy would continue to suffer, and at some point within the next year, year and a half, much of the popular support for the president would be lost, and that would essentially eliminate his real leverage within the elite. Because ultimately, I think we know that very well over here, once the population grows disillusioned from the ideas or the hopes that the president puts forward, the support amongst the population tends to erode. And this would definitely happen to the Iranians at some point, to the Rouhani team, if they couldn't get a deal. And from the president's perspective, if there isn't a deal, if they actually finally made a real effort, a determined effort at diplomacy, and still they couldn't get a deal, then the arguments that diplomacy have been exhausted would, for the first time, actually carry some degree of truth in it. And that would create a scenario in which the voices in favor of military action would quadruple. And the president just had a very bad experience trying to push for a war, and he got quite a lot of pushback from the population. So this would certainly not be a route that he would like to go down again. But more importantly, this is not a winnable war. And this is a president who kind of got a Nobel Peace Prize on credit. And now he's looking for an opportunity to create a legacy. Clearly on domestic issues, he needs it, but it's going to be extremely difficult. And if you're now looking around in the Middle East and asking yourself, which one issue could I potentially get some success on in the next year, 2 years and a half before I have to leave office, so at least leave some sort of a legacy, something positive? Paradoxically, Iran is now the lowest hanging fruit in the Middle East. Syria is a disaster. Israel-Palestine is always not looking particularly good. Egypt is lost. Yemen is just waiting to explode. Suddenly Iran actually has a prospect of success despite of the very clear difficulties that makes it attractive, and I think that is one of the major factors as to why the president, once Rouhani got elected and he felt that there actually was a serious, sophisticated, committed partner on the other side, that the president now has committed political will and his own name towards this process in a way that he has not done at all since he took office. And that, combined with the fact that the Iranians are doing the same, is creating a dramatically different situation in the negotiations than ever has existed. But still, it didn't mean that it was easy, and it didn't mean that it couldn't have collapsed. The talks were supposed to end Friday, but they continued on to Saturday, and that's when John Kerry showed up, and then all of the other foreign ministers showed up. And then a lot of us were thinking, well, they're only showing up because the deal already is had, and they just had to wait for them to show up so that the photo op could be there without any one of them missing. But then it just kept on dragging on, and then it became 10 p.m. at night. And then the talk was that John Kerry has to go to London the day after, curiously because he needed to have a meeting with the British foreign minister in London on the day after, whereas the British foreign minister was staying at the same hotel. Didn't really make sense to fly to London to meet with him. But as time went on, people started to think, well, if it can drag on into one other day, they actually have to walk home without a deal. And how's that going to be for John Kerry? Twice now he's showed up, committed himself, put his name on the line to get a nuclear deal, and twice he would have to walk home empty-handed. Already now when they have a deal, we're hearing Munich, surrender. Imagine what would happen if he didn't get a deal, if he didn't have anything to show for after all of these diplomatic efforts. So towards the end, it was quite dramatic, and a lot of people thought that perhaps it wouldn't happen. And then we saw one Iranian journalist run down the stairs towards her laptop, and everyone rushes over to see, okay, that person must have known something because she was coming from upstairs, and that's where the negotiators are. And the Iranian diplomats tended to talk much more with their journalists than the American diplomats. The American diplomats were very, very disciplined, hardly said a word. I mean, if you got a hi from them when they walked through in the hall, you would be lucky. And everyone thought, okay, something is happening. And we rush over there, and she says, there is a deal. And it's been, and they're just working out on some logistics. So it starts to spread, but there's no confirmation. The only person who knows about it is one Iranian journalist, and the Iranian media doesn't have the best reputation of, putting out information that has been confirmed 3 times before you publish it. So there was a lot of confusion taking place, and for about another hour, a lot of people thought there is no deal. But sure enough, it was confirmed later on that there actually was a deal. What she was saying was actually not incorrect, The delay was partly because they were debating how and where and when will they have the signing ceremony. And it ended up being a signing ceremony without an audience, because they have a media center just 10 minutes away, and that's where people expected it to be, but instead they decided to have it at the Palais, because I'm not going to name who, but some of the negotiators don't like to have media and they don't like them too much. So this was all done without any actual journalists in the room. But then they later on came in after 23 hours of negotiations on the last day. And John Kerry, who I assume is 70 years or up, gave about a 40-minute presentation as crisp as it could be. You could never have expected that he had been awake and negotiated for 23 hours before giving that press conference. We were exhausted, but we were mostly playing with Twitter for 23 hours. That was very tiring, but these guys were actually negotiating. And they came in there, and the presentation was made. And if I can say if I have a couple of minutes, just to say a couple of things about, and I'm saying this because I feel that this, the White House has not been given a fair treatment in the media. References to Munich and surrender is frankly absurd. The Iranians gave the vast majority of concessions in this round. That doesn't mean that they lost. In fact, people in Tehran are celebrating. But in this round, they gave more than the US. And they did so because of the investment that in the second round, they will get not necessarily more, but it will balance out. Because it's in the second round where the main leverages of both sides will be traded. And that is, from the American side at this point, banking sanctions and oil sanctions. And from the Iranian side, it would be to agree to the additional protocol and give the full-scale type of inspections access to the various, to the IAEA. Whereas, and Barbara and I disagree on this a little bit, believing that sanctions is what got this done. I think if one says that sanctions enabled this situation to come about from the American perspective, and I think it is understandable that if one looks at it, it may leave that impression. One can also say from the Iranian side that it's 19,000 centrifuges that got the Americans to the table. Because the Bush administration refused to come to the table. When the Iranians, this very same team, in 2005, offered to cap uranium enrichment at no more than 3,000 centrifuges, we said no, because we were committed to the idea that there should be zero enrichment at the time. And lo and behold, 8 years later, they have 19,000 centrifuges. Both sides, in my view, have built on a lot of added leverage that they're now trading away. And I'm not so sure that either side actually managed to outpace the other when it comes to that leverage. If anything, I think in the last 8 years, both sides have exhausted their pipe dreams. The Iranian pipe dream that they could just present a fait accompli to the West with an unfettered nuclear program without any restrictions, a complete recognition of their right, was a pipe dream. Was never going to happen, and it's not happening. The Western pipe dream that you could push back the Iranians and have them surrender and give up their nuclear program in totality, have not a single spinning centrifuge, was also a pipe dream. We lost 8 years chasing that pipe dream, and now both sides have exhausted it, and they have no real escalatory cards left to play that wouldn't risk war. And as a result, they're doing what actually makes diplomacy happen and work. And what is that? You compromise. The reason there is a deal is because both sides have accepted each other's bottom line. The West has accepted that Iran is going to keep enrichment, but it's going to be limited. It's going to be below 5%. And this is enabling the Iranians to say that their right to enrich has been respected and that their dignity has been retained. That's critical for them. But at the same time, the Iranians have accepted the American bottom line, and that is Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon. And the path towards a nuclear weapon has been closed because with the inspections and the other limitations, the Iranians will no longer have an undetectable breakout capability. If they try to cheat, we will know very soon, and we will have plenty of time to do something about it. The two bottom lines have now converged. They both have accepted it, and that's part of the reason why there is a breakthrough. But I have to say, it's not a done deal because the main leverages have not been exchanged yet. And here I would say the challenge may perhaps actually be more on the American side because it's not in the hands of the president. If it was, I have no doubt that he would be able to deliver on it. But the main leverage points that the Iranians want in return for them to give up their cards is sanctions that have to go through Congress. The president can use waivers, but I personally have doubts as to whether there can be a final, complete, permanent solution that ends this issue if the sanctions are still on the books, but every 6 months, the next, and every future president honors the deal by continuing to use his waivers. It may work, I don't know, but I have a doubt. I definitely doubt that the Iranians would go along with that, because just waiving sanctions is a inherently reversible measure. And the principle that has been established for this negotiation is that both sides will exchange reversible concessions for reversible concessions and irreversible concessions for irreversible concessions. We want them to give irreversible concessions. That requires us to offer them irreversible concessions. And in the next couple of months, that will be fought out in this city between the White House and Congress. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's a great place to stop, because I think underlying all of this is the whole bitter history of the U.S. and Iran, and no one better to talk about that than John Limbert, who has experienced it in many different ways. So, John, did this agreement, is this really going to make a difference between the U.S. and Iran, not just on the nuclear front?
Good. Well, as our Iranian friends like to say, there are only two possibilities. It either will or it won't. And so there we are. It's actually quite simple at bottom. No, thank you, Trita and Barbara, both of whom are good friends and colleagues and have been speaking and writing very sensibly about Iran for many years. I mean, this is as you know, in this town, this is a very passionate subject. I tell my students at the Naval Academy that one could spend his life going to Iran events in Washington, whether it's the Wilson Center, the World Affairs Council, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. I mean, every ideological point of view, everyone, and you would never run out of subjects to talk about. It's an issue, I think at the end of the day, it's an issue that a small number of people care about passionately. Probably, I say a small number, probably 30% of that group is here in this room tonight. But what I'm going to put the question of so what and now what? In other words, are we and the Iranians finally getting off of a road to nowhere? A road that we have been stuck on for 30 years. Remember, in June of 2009, President Obama offered the Iranians a new beginning based on mutual respect, based on mutual interests, and that laid behind the grievances of the past. That approach, unfortunately, caught the Iranians off guard, because what he had done was to discredit decades of anti-American rhetoric, a staple of the diet in Tehran. How does one paint as an enemy someone who sends you greetings on Nowruz, who quotes the poet Sa'di, and who speaks of mutual respect, something that the Iranians had always said they wanted? The response to the president's outreach and offer was, to say the least, disappointing. It was as though the Iranians saw him not as an enemy, but as something more dangerous, as a rival. And the word they used was havu. Now, havu, as our Iranian friends know, means co-wife. Something more dangerous, more attractive, and younger, and therefore something you fear more than the enemy. Now, it's been 5 years since that original outreach, and finally, it looks like these efforts are getting a response. Now, whatever the value of the current nuclear deal, whether you denounce it or whether you support it, you cannot deny that today we are in a very different place with Iran than we have been for the last 34 years. Just look at what we have. Hassan is talking to Hussein. Think about that. The two foreign ministers are having professional discussion and productive discussions. Remember that, I remember this, some of you may remember this, the last time before September of 2013 that the two foreign ministers met was in October of 1979. And these meetings between then Secretary of State Vance and Foreign Minister Yazdi were disastrous. And Cyrus Vance, ever the cool, polished diplomat, walked out of those meetings just completely exasperated. So, what should we do? I think, before we sort of jump in and say this is a great deal or this is a terrible deal, we should step back take a few steps back and take a deep breath and admit that we and the Iranians are now talking to each other, interacting in a way that 5 months ago was unthinkable. Just couldn't imagine it. Why is this so? What's changed? Well, some will credit the sanctions with pushing the Iranian side to change their approach. It may be true, but I'm cautious here. I think in the case of the sanctions, or the question is why, you need to make a distinction between what you know to be true and what you wish to be true. And I think there are people who wish the sanctions had done this, and therefore they say the sanctions did it. What we know to be true is that the Iranian economy is in bad shape. The Iran with its resources, with its educated population, with its geography, it should be economically, it should be a paradise. It is clearly not. It is clearly not a paradise. Let me end, as I like to do, with something from the great Jalaluddin Rumi. He said something, and it was echoed in a beautiful poem by Robert Frost called "The Pasture." And 800 years ago, Rumi said, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. It looks like we may at last be meeting in a field beyond the ideas of centrifuges and subterfuges. We're not there yet, but there are possibilities that just a few months ago no one could have imagined." Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I will play devil's advocate. You accuse me of being too positive, Trita. So let me take the view of those who say, as Benjamin Netanyahu did, that this is a historic mistake, that we're being cheated, that the Iranians will not keep their part of the bargain, and that sanctions will unravel and we will lose all the leverage that we've developed. You said that the Iranians gave more than the Americans did in this round. I'm not so sure. The sanctions relief that the U.S. is giving is small. It's worth a few $1 billion. But symbolically, when you look at the fact that the entire international community had coalesced around these sanctions, we'd reached the maximum point of leverage. Now those sanctions are going to begin to be eased. And the question that a lot of critics raise is, once you start down that path, will you ever be able to get sanctions back up to the point that they are at now? And haven't we given more than the Iranians have?
Thank you. Yeah, that is one of the critiques of this deal. So a couple of points on that. The first point is the assumption then is that if we don't do a deal, the sanctions would still be there and they would continue to hurt the Iranians. That, I think, is a very questionable assumption for a very simple reason. John, I think, put it brilliantly what Obama did when he came into power. He was this extremely different American president that the Iranians just could not wrap their heads around because he was quoting Persian poets and speaking well, and his middle name was Hussein. And as a result of that, and the fact that the president then really tried with diplomacy once, it failed, but the narrative that got created, largely true, perhaps partly exaggerated, was that it fell through because the Iranians. And as a result, the president could go very efficiently and tell the rest of the world to agree to sanctions that they never had agreed to before, that the Bush administration didn't even dare to dream about because the Bush administration had no legitimacy on the international scene at that time. And now they could agree to it because there was a sense that, hey, the United States actually tried. The United States was the good guy. Rouhani is now playing the exact same trick on the United States. He is tweeting Rosh Hashanah greetings to the Jewish people. His foreign minister is extremely sophisticated and charming. They are putting forward proposals that are clearly constructive and flexible. They are serious about diplomacy. In the last rounds of negotiations, about a day was spent on just deciding when and where will the next meeting be. The Iranians made suggestions such as Kabul, because clearly Kabul is a safe place to negotiate. And they were playing games like this about everything. Everything was a negotiation. Now, it takes about 5 minutes to decide this. The venue is already set. It will always be Geneva. The only thing is that they combine their schedules. So now, there's no excuse. The Iranians are really trying. That is the impression on the international scene. And that has translated into a lot of countries who have agreed to these sanctions and who have agreed to them very grudgingly because ultimately they don't like to be in a bad economic situation and on top of that impose sanctions that causes them to lose even more jobs and hurt their economy even further. Several of those countries are in Europe and they're not small countries. They are now putting pressure on the United States saying this chance we're not going to miss because we're not going to continue to do economic harakiri for an idea that actually the time has come for it, but because of your Congress, you're just not willing to be a statesman because Congress is playing politics with everything. So if it fails now, it's not going to be particularly difficult. If it fails, particularly if the US is saying that they refuse to lift sanctions, it's going to be very easy for the Iranians to shift the blame away from themselves onto the United States, and at that point, the Iranians can get far more sanctions relief that they're currently getting. Not all of the sanctions clearly will be able to be lifted, but they may be able to say, 20% of the sanctions would drift away, with one big difference. 20% of the sanctions would go away without the Iranians giving a single concession. Single access to Iraq, single camera for the IAEA. None of that would be achieved, and many of the sanctions would fall apart. Why? Because the US could not take yes for an answer. That's the risk of overplaying our hands. In fact, again, going back to history, when the Iranians offered to stop their program at 3,000 centrifuges and today they have 19,000, we need to be honest with ourselves and realize that the cost of us overplaying our hands in the past is that they now have 19,000 centrifuges. Want to do that again? The leverage the Obama administration has managed to put in place to balance out that the Iranians have so many centrifuges will also be lost without the Iranians giving any concessions.
John, do you want to jump in on this too before I go to the next question?
Very briefly. I find many of these critiques, not yours, of course, Barbara, but many of these critiques about as predictable as a Clarence Thomas Supreme Court decision. I mean, you know what you're going to get. You and I could write these things. You could write these things. In terms of the assumption lying behind them is often, well, you can't trust them.
They'll cheat.
Pardon?
They'll cheat.
They'll cheat. Well, I would say only this, that if we and the Iranians could never agree on anything, then what about what we agreed on in Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, with the same team, or what we agreed on back in 1991, again with largely the same team, about the Lebanon hostages, or something that affects me personally. I mean, if we and the Iranians could never agree on anything at all, then I and 51 of my colleagues would still be in Tehran.
All right. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to you, and that is about Israel and Netanyahu. I have a theory. I'm going to try it out, and both of you tell me if you think it's crazy or not. Netanyahu has been consistently negative about these negotiations, and he's decried the proposal before it was finished. He said it was a historic mistake. After it was announced, he said it was a historic mistake. Is it possible that he's simply playing his assigned role in this, and that it's actually helpful for him to be so negative? For a couple of reasons. One, because it makes it easier for the Iranians to defend the agreement. I mean, if Netanyahu were jumping up and down for joy, it would make it very difficult for Hassan Rouhani to say he'd gotten a good deal. And two, because it maintains pressure on the United States and the rest of the negotiators to get more concessions out of Iran in the final deal. Is it possible that Bibi Netanyahu is overplaying this because of those two reasons, and that it's actually helpful in a way?
I like your theory. I don't know if it's. I have no idea if it's true. If it's true or not. But it's true that by opposing the deal the way he is, he's certainly helping Rouhani and others deal with some of their more difficult constituencies. I don't think he's doing this on purpose. I somehow doubt it. My own sense is that Netanyahu really still, in his heart, he misses Ahmadinejad. Yeah, he wishes
They were a great team.
They were. He was the gift. I mean, Ahmadinejad was the gift that kept on giving, as far as Israel was concerned.
And now Netanyahu is the gift that keeps on giving for the Iranians.
That's right. But you know, at the end of the day, what's interesting about it is that there are a lot of currents within Israel. It seemed to be, at least from what I understand from some of my Israeli friends, that are questioning his approach and saying, you are not serving the interests of Israel by isolating it by getting into a public spat, a public disagreement with the United States.
Trita, you've followed the Israeli debate a lot. Is it useful, though, that he remains so negative? I mean, will that put pressure on the United States to try to get more concessions out of the Iranians? Or is he isolating himself? Will he be less relevant as these negotiations go on?
I think certainly he has become less relevant, and I think that has actually been very problematic for Israel. I wrote in my book, in my first book, that at the end of the day, to serve Israel's interest and its concerns, because it has legitimate concerns about this issue, it is actually more helpful to be helpful towards the process and ensure that you can be part of the process and influence it from inside and have an impact on the agenda, instead of taking this extremely, extremely negative public position against it, and as a result, having been, frankly, to a certain extent, excluded. There are a lot that indicates that the Israelis did not know about the secret channel. And at a minimum, even if they had hints about it, they did not know the content of the conversations. If they knew about it, then it's very difficult to understand why they were spreading data that was completely false, such as saying that the US had offered the Iranians $50 billion of sanctions relief, which was clearly not true. So if they knew the content, why did they deliberately say something they knew was not true? I think they didn't know. And I think it's a high risk that they actually, frankly, may not have known about the channel at all. Ephraim Halevi, the former head of Mossad, characterizes this at essentially agreeing what I wrote in my book and saying Israel is paying the price now for having adopted the position of Netanyahu and having been so negative to this process, so that the US felt that they could not include Israel, could not fully inform them about some of these things. So I don't think this is helpful for Israel. I don't think this got more concessions from the Iranians. I don't think it is helpful for the administration to have Netanyahu come out and say this is a historic mistake, etc. This is only raising the political cost for the administration back home when they have to deal with Congress, etc. In fact, if anything, it's probably cost the administration more than it's cost the Iranians. I think the reality is that on three key issues over the course of the last couple of years, Israel and the US's interest in the region have started to clearly diverge. Doesn't mean that they won't be strong allies or anything like that, but on the issue of Iran, on the issue of Israel-Palestine, and on the central issue, what is now happening in the Arab world, with the Arab Spring and the uprisings, etc., the Israeli and the American perspective have diverged. And that goes to the larger issue, that the American-led order in the region essentially fell apart once the US invaded Iraq and it became so costly that it weakened the United States. And the US is now trying to adjust to a new reality. The new reality means that there's going to be rising populations in many different Arab worlds, and the US is no longer going to guarantee the survival of many of these autocrats. The United States, at the last possible moment, shifted and sided with the protesters in Tahrir Square instead of backing Mubarak. And then later on, when there was essentially a coup by the deep state in Egypt, the US was not in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, but at the same time not going to be in favor of seeing Egypt go back to being a military dictatorship. Whereas the Israeli perspective has been quite different. They were very upset with the US not standing by Mubarak. So this has created a lot of tensions, and that's just in addition to the fact that the personal chemistry between the president and the prime minister doesn't seem to be the best, as well as between the secretary of state of the prime minister. So the idea that this is some sort of a coordinated, extremely well executed theater that is geniusly designed to add a little bit more pressure on the Iranian negotiations, I'm not seeing any evidence for. I don't see them being able to pull it off that way.
Oh, well, it was a good theory.
Yeah.
We're going to go to your questions now.
Still like it.
We have a microphone.
I was looking at a story, the Islamic Republic News Agency, the official news agency of Iran, November 24th, denying that there were any bilateral talks. Iran on Sunday dismissed speculation by the Associated Press about bilateral talks with the United States. Foreign Ministry official rejected the AP report. Why would the Foreign Ministry reject this report? Is there some internal dissension going on in Iran? And in that respect,
Sure.
what about Khamenei? We haven't mentioned him.
Sure.
His letter seemed very bland, his letter of endorsement in response to Rouhani. He hasn't publicly really embraced this deal.
I would disagree. He actually has embraced the deal, and Rouhani gave a very happy speech today, which he counts as the 100th day of his presidency. He counts from the day when his cabinet was seated. No, I would disagree. I would say the Supreme Leader has given a lot of support. In terms of why Iran would deny that there had been secret talks, maybe, John, you're really best placed to talk about this, that the Iranians still have a kind of allergy to admitting that they are doing what they're doing, which is negotiating face-to-face with the Americans, right?
That's right. That's right. I for one am shocked to learn that there's deception going on in the Islamic Republic News Agency. I mean, that's just terrible.
Just to add, I think it's a very good question, and there are certain political peculiarities over there in which they're doing this. They're celebrating the outcome and denying the process. And there's certain peculiarities on the American side in which we got a deal, but we just cannot help ourselves of accusing ourselves of surrender in Munich. It's just certain realities that are unfortunate, not helpful, but they're not going to change overnight.
There's another factor, too, which is that if they admit that there were talks, then the Iranians will want to know, well, who was conducting those talks? And that could put whoever it was, whether it was Zarif or the deputy foreign minister or some other negotiator, in a rather awkward position. They'd have to go in front of Parliament, and they'd be asked, what did you tell the Americans? What have you promised?
There was an interesting comment, but the anthropologist Babak Rahimi made a very interesting comment this morning. I think it was on NPR, and he talked about the dualities within Iranian political culture, the ability to believe two contradictory things at the same time. For example, the fact that Twitter and Facebook are banned and blocked, while the leaders, the president, the supreme leader, the foreign minister, all have their own Facebook pages and Twitter accounts.
And they're addicted to them.
And they're addicted to it. So the fact that the negotiations are happening while they are not happening shouldn't be, I think, very surprising.
One other factor too, and that is that the people who lost the election are not happy at all. And so they are looking for ways to snipe, to bring down the government, to show that this is not such a big deal. And they're still there. They're temporarily contained, but they're still very much there, and it's something that I think we have to be aware of. They have their hardliners just as we have ours, and there could be people who will jeopardize this agreement. Certainly over the next 6 months, we will see who has more discipline and which administration is able to keep its opponents of the deal in check better.
It seems to me the key thing here is Congress. And many members of the Republican Party are determined not to give President Obama a victory at any cost. And I'm just worried that this agreement will get caught up in that kind of politics. What is the role that Congress has to play on this agreement? It's not a treaty. At some point, I guess it will be a treaty where their advice and consent is necessary, or is that not the case?
Go ahead.
I don't envision there necessarily having to be a treaty, but Congress is nevertheless key, because this is the big difference between the European sanctions and the American sanctions. The Europeans pass their sanctions through their executive branches. The 27, 28 foreign ministers meet. They have a foreign ministry meeting and they sign on to it. With a stroke of the pen, the sanctions are there. With a stroke of a pen, the sanctions are gone. None of the national legislators are involved in this process. Anything that goes through a legislative process obviously takes much more time, has far less flexibility, is by design created to take time in order to make sure that there aren't any fast changes. The American sanctions are a spider's web, according to the ICG report. I think that was a very good formulation. It's very difficult to move one without moving all. And most importantly, the key sanctions, the biggest sanctions architectures go through Congress. And only Congress can lift sanctions. If it was only executive orders, the president can, again, with a stroke of a pen, take them away. They disappear. But if it's a congressional act, only Congress can undo them. And this creates a significant difficulty because we are in an unprecedented partisan atmosphere, it appears. Congress and its fight with the president brought us to a government shutdown, which at first people didn't think would happen, and then it happened, and then it almost brought us to a default, would have significant repercussions for the global economy. You know, stopping a nuclear deal with Iran is nothing for these guys compared to all of that. For 34 years, there has not been a conversation on Capitol Hill about lifting sanctions. At most, at the utmost generosity of these members of Congress, the conversation has been, okay, we will delay these new sanctions for 3 weeks. That's the best we've had so far. Now it's going to be a completely different paradigm. You're going to have to find a couple of members of Congress from both sides of the aisle that will put their name on a legislation that essentially authorizes Congress to lift these sanctions. Obviously, this cannot come until the very, very end of the process. But also, the Iranian counter concession, which is to ratify the additional protocol, will have to go through their parliament. And the sad thing is, it's visible now how their parliament is picking up bad ideas from our Congress on how to create more difficulties and just be impossible to deal with.
But also we have to point out that not all the sanctions will have to be lifted. The ones that are related to terrorism, to human rights would remain. These are only the nuclear-related sanctions that are specified in the agreement. So, you know, the U.S. and Iran are still going to have sanctions between them for a very long time. The question is whether all the other relief that the Iranians might get from the Europeans, Asians, and others would be sufficient to seal the deal. John, you wanted to add something?
The reality, and you can correct me on this one, maybe people in the audience know better, but I understand that there were sanctions against the former Soviet Union that remained for some 20 years after the Soviet Union had disappeared. I mean, the political act of getting Congress to reverse them is very cumbersome. The other thing that I experienced when I was working at the State Department, back in 2009 and 2010 on Iranian affairs was when one spoke individually to many members of Congress on both sides, people were very reasonable and sensible on this issue. But when it came to a vote and a public statement, these things passed by very large with very large margins, and it's clear. I think that the president's and the administration's strategy on this is to avoid another vote, because even if the sanctions even if it's non-binding, this is very difficult to explain to the Iranians. Just a 30-second history lesson here. In 1979, in the spring of 1979, the United States appointed a new ambassador to revolutionary Iran. This was a this was a confidence-building measure. This was a goodwill gesture, something that the revolutionaries said they wanted as a sign of American goodwill. While that ambassador after his name was submitted to Tehran, Congress passed a non-binding resolution. It's called the Javits Resolution, condemning the excesses of the revolutionary courts. And in Tehran, people went wild. The media, everyone, just went on a frenzy of denunciation and sank the nomination. In terms of explaining, as we attempted to do at the embassy, attempting to say this is a non-binding resolution, we got nowhere. So yes, the possibility, it's good you raise this, and the possibility of something like this repeating what happened in '79 and derailing the process is still very much out there.
My question is regarding what implications do you think this deal has for the other sticking points between the United States and the Iranian government? You mentioned terrorism, human rights, things like that. What do you think this signals for going forward?
You know, I think that this was a necessary first step, that we were never going to be able to have the discussion about Syria or Hezbollah or 500 political prisoners or the two candidates from the 2009 election still being under house arrest, that it would have been difficult to have those conversations without a nuclear agreement. Now that we have a nuclear agreement, it's my hope that we can broaden the conversation. And I would love to see a restoration of diplomatic relations. That's not going to happen, obviously, for a while. But if we now have routine conversations between John Kerry and Javad Zarif and others on a lower level, that really does open up a lot of prospects. And not next month, but in January, there's going to be a conference in Geneva on Syria, and most likely the Iranians will be there, along with the Americans and the Saudis and the Russians and others. John, do you want to add something?
I for one, have always advocated a broader agenda with Iran. And it always seemed to me that the nuclear issue there were issues that were so vital to each side, issues of legality, issues of non-proliferation, issues of national pride, that this was going to be very difficult to resolve. And that what had happened is we were, if you'll pardon the expression, holding the whole relationship hostage to the nuclear issue, which is a very tough one to go. I will say, however, that although some people within the administration agreed with me, in general, that line of argument got nowhere. And it's very clear that at least within the P5+1, the context of the P5+1, it's all nuclear all the time. And until that issue gets, maybe there are signs of progress to move beyond it. It was interesting to me, for example, when the president spoke after this deal was reached, I didn't hear him say anything about a new beginning. What he had said in 2009. I think, I don't know, but I suppose at this time that would be a bridge too far in terms of this administration. And they're saying, look, this is the major issue, and this is what we're going for.
Could I just add one small thing to that?
Sure.
I think John is absolutely right. I was in complete agreement with him that a broadening of an agenda actually would have made things easier. Now they managed to get the first deal, and both sides actually were very much focused on only focusing on the nuclear issue for the first time. Now I think, however, even though the nuclear issue clearly is not resolved, I think there's going to be a joint interest to expand it, because now they have gotten over the first hurdle. Now they need a whole set of other issues in which they can collaborate on to build maximum trust, maximum confidence, in order to insulate and make sure that the nuclear track now is as protected and as solid as possible, so that the inevitable difficulties it will run into will not derail it, by making sure that they kind of hedging it with a couple of other issues. There already has been at least conversations on human rights issues. There appears to have been something in regards to Syria as well, because Lakhdar Brahimi was going in and out of the hotel as we were there, who is the coordinator of the Syria conference. And I think all of that is very much positive, because at the end of the day, the fact that the United States and Iran could not deal with each other in spite of their disagreements, I'm not saying that this disagreement should vanish, but the fact that they couldn't even talk to each other exasperated almost not only all of their own problems, but almost every other problem in the region. Now when it has been normalized, there's no longer going to be a headline in any newspaper if Kerry picks up the phone and calls Zarif.
Yeah.
That's now no longer news. It's no longer a taboo to break again. I think the possibilities are going to be quite great. It doesn't mean they're going to become friends. It doesn't mean that the two countries are going to be on a fantastic path. But they're clearly walking away from the brink of disaster.
Absolutely. That seems like a really great moment to stop. So I think we're going to. And I want to thank you all very much for your questions, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.